In this lab, we will explore the effects of objects colliding and analyze their motion using our knowledge of the momentum principle. We will then explore how the energy principle allows us to determine the energy changes occurring within the system consisting of two carts. The type of motion analyzed in this lab is an inelastic collision between two carts of equal mass. When one cart, having an initial velocity, is rolled toward another car at rest, the collision occurs and they stick together. After tracking the motion and creating a computer model of the collision, we were able to predict the observed motion successfully, show that the momentum principle was conserved, as well as see that kinetic energy was transferred to another form of energy during the collision. Again, the principles that are in use in this lab are the momentum principle and the energy principle. The momentum principle tells us that the change in the object's momentum is equal to the net force divided by the change in time. In a collision like this, the net force is effectively zero because the interactions between the two carts are significantly greater than the interactions between the surroundings, leaving us with delta P equal to zero. So, from this principle, we should expect the momentum to be conserved, meaning that the initial momentum is equal to the final momentum. The initial momentum consists of the momentum of the moving cart plus the momentum of the resting cart. Secondly, the energy principle can tell us what energy changes are happening in the system, which consists of cart 1 and cart 2. The principle states that work equals the total change in energy, and we note that the total energy changes in this collision include changes in kinetic energy and changes in internal energy. Since the interactions between the system and the surroundings are negligible, the total change in energy is zero, meaning that the work done on the system is zero. Rearranging the energy principle, we get that the change in internal energy equals the negative change in kinetic energy. To start off the measurements, the positions of each cart were measured at each video frame and tracker, and then positions of the center of mass of the system after the collision were tracked. Taking the position data and converting it to a CSV file, we upload it into Python and compare the observed data with our computational model. In VPython, boxes were created to represent the carts involved in the collision. The boxes had the lengths, heights, and masses of average dynamic carts seen in many physics laboratories. They are taken to have equal measurements with a mass of 0.5 kilograms, lengths of 0.1688 meters, and a height of 0.0762 meters. The third dimension was ignored because the motion was linear in this experiment. I also created a small sphere to represent the center of mass of the observed motion. This helps to show that in an inelastic collision, the two initially separate objects now move together with a single center of mass and velocity. Initial conditions were also entered into the Python code, including the position vectors of each cart when the video started and the initial velocities. Notice that the y position of the carts are shifted down by half a meter. This is done to help see a comparison between the model and the observed data. The data to create the visualization of the observed motion was entered here, and the time step, delta t, was also 1/10. Also notice that the momentum, mass times velocity, for each cart had to be specified, and the total initial momentum was entered, which is just the momentum of cart 1 plus the momentum of cart 2 before the collision. To model the motion we observed, I had to make use of the momentum principle and the idea that momentum was conserved in the collision. Derived from this principle is the position information. It tells us that the final position of the cart equals the initial position plus its velocity times delta t. So Python iterates this data at each time step of the object's motion in the model under the duration of the while loop. To model the collision, I had to create an if statement under the while loop that stated essentially what the law of conservation of momentum states. When the objects come into contact, the total momentum was still equal to the mass velocity products of each cart, but after the collision, their velocities became equivalent, making the final velocity equal to the total momentum divided by the sum of the two masses. This result can be obtained by rearranging this principle and solving for velocity. We run the model and obtain this result. The computational model is shown with the blue and red box, while the observed motion is visualized with the yellow and green boxes. The center of mass between the two carts is given by the black sphere. As we can see, the model does a decent job of predicting the observed motion, with just a slight overprediction after the collision. But regardless, the model does well to predict the motion, so we will use it for the analysis of our energy changes. Entered into the code was information regarding the energy principle, including the equation for kinetic energy, which is 1/2 mass times the magnitude of velocity squared. These energies were entered for each cart, and with this information we can determine that the total kinetic energy was just the kinetic energy of cart 1 plus the kinetic energy of cart 2 before the collision. After contact, this information had to be updated. The final momentum, as stated earlier, is now the sum of the cart's masses times the final velocity, which is equal since the collision is inelastic. The total final kinetic energy can now be found by plugging in the final conditions given from the model. As we stated earlier, the total energy change in the system is zero, so we can additionally update the energy principle after the collision. To obtain the information from the model, we can print the change in momentum, the final velocity of the carts, delta k, and delta e internal, giving us these values. Comparing our computational results to our results calculated by hand from the observation, we find that the final velocity after the collision was slightly slower than the result of the model. This discrepancy could be a result of not accounting for friction between the carts and the surface of the model. As a result of the slower than predicted velocity, the change in kinetic energy of the observed motion is greater. Despite the discrepancy and the small error, we determine that the model does a proper job of predicting the motion. In both cases, our results demonstrate our physics principles. The change in kinetic energy is negative because the carts slow down after colliding, allowing the internal energy to increase. The final velocity is slower in the inelastic collision, and it is about half the initial velocity of cart 1, conserving the momentum of the system. Finally, leading to the change in momentum being conserved, showing little to no change in our observation and our model. So what do these results mean? What actually is an increase in internal energy? Well, the internal energy can come in many forms, including rotational energy, vibrational energy, or thermal energy. In this collision, it is likely that the internal energy consists of a combination of a rise in thermal energy and a rise in vibrational energy. These changes make sense because we know that when objects interact, there is usually a heat exchange, and when the kinetic energy is lost, it must transfer to another form of energy. So in conclusion, we were able to use momentum and energy principles to analyze and create a model showing the motion and energy transfers involved in an inelastic collision. What we found from our results were that in this type of collision, the total energy remains constant along with the total momentum. And to account for the decrease in kinetic energy, the internal energy of the system increases. Thank you for watching.